The Palestinian cause has always been a core pillar of the Arab and Muslim homeland, the Ummah, as well as an important religious issue. Palestine's capital, Jerusalem, is home to the three major monotheistic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And of course, the Palestinian issue is also an issue of anti-imperialism. Israel was created in the wake of a mandate under the British Empire, and the Zionist ideology consists of dispossessing Palestinians of their homes and giving them to Jewish settlers from Europe and elsewhere. Let's take a look at 73 years of Israeli occupation in Palestine and international support for the Palestinian struggle. I'm Richard Medhurst, and you're watching the Communiqué. In 1916, during World War I, the British and French empires carved up the Middle East and divided it between themselves under the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement, named after Sykes, a British diplomat, and Picot, a French diplomat. During that time, the British had used the Arab tribes to organize an Arab revolt, rising up against the Ottoman Empire and defeating them with promises of independence for the Arabs. But these promises of an Arab homeland were short-lived and instead replaced with more colonial rule once again. In 1917, the British government issued a public statement saying that it would create a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Shortly after, following the end of World War I, Palestine became a mandate under British rule from 1923 to 1948. In 1947, the United Nations came up with a partition plan which would divide Palestine in one half for the Arabs, one half for the Jews, and the Holy City of Jerusalem as a separate international entity. When the United Nations officially adopted the partition plan, 33 nations voted in favor, 13 against, and 10 abstained. The Palestinians and Arabs vehemently rejected this plan, which was seen as just another colonial partitioning, but this time for different settlers. After the British mandate was up in May 1948 and the Israelis declared their so-called independence on the last day, the other Arab countries declared war in support of Palestine. Among them, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen. This war resulted in a defeat for the Palestinians and Arabs and is known in Arabic as the Nakba, the catastrophe or cataclysm. Palestinians were robbed of their homeland, their independence, and their right to self-determination. This was followed by destruction of homes, villages, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. Millions of Palestinians were forced to flee in a mass exodus, seeking refuge in neighboring countries like Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Millions more were displaced and scattered internally inside Palestine, becoming refugees and stateless on their own land. And to this day, Palestine is not recognized as a state by the United Nations, despite the fact that Israel is, even though Israel is sitting on Palestinian land, occupying the Palestinian people, and made up of settlers who come from around the world and are not indigenous to Palestine. 1948 was not the only attempt by the Arabs to liberate Palestine. They tried many more times throughout the 20th century, again in 1967, 1973, and have supported the various Palestinian resistance and liberation groups throughout the years. Although there have been several wars and attempts to liberate Palestine, Arab support for the Palestinian cause has varied greatly through these many decades. Some consider the Arab support to be invaluable in keeping the Palestinian cause alive and sustaining the resistance. However, others feel that Arab countries' support has not always been unwavering, and in some cases, even blunted parts of the Palestinian resistance in order to protect their own interests, which is seen as being selfish and not in the interest of Palestine. The 1950s and 1960s marked the peak of Arab nationalism. In a period of decolonization or supposed decolonization, many Arab countries sought to unite with each other, and leaders like Egyptian President Abdel Nasser were revered all across the Arab world. The idea of Arab unity or pan-Arabism even resulted in Syria and Egypt forming one country called the United Arab Republic from 1958 until 1971. Egypt even kept this name for several years, and Syria still has the same flag to this day. However, at the height of all this, the war in June of 1967 marked the first great defeat for the Arab world. The Six-Day War resulted in a crushing, resounding military defeat. In a period of just 6 days, the Arabs could do nothing to liberate Palestine and in fact lost even more territory than they had begun with. As a result, Israel captured the Golan Heights from Syria, the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip from Egypt, the West Bank and Jerusalem from Jordan. It was a soul-crushing and humiliating defeat that resulted in the fracture of Arab nationalism in Nasser's resignation and showed that the Arabs lacked unity. If the Arabs were too divided to even defend their own land, how could they possibly free Palestine and the holy city of Jerusalem? And since then, Israel has continued to illegally occupy the vast majority of these territories in violation of international law. So far, Israel has only given back the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, but still illegally occupies everything else. There have been multiple United Nations resolutions demanding that Israel withdraw from these lands and recognizing them as not Israeli. United Nations Security Council Resolution 242, which was passed in November of 1967, clearly it demands the withdrawal of Israel armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict. However, to this day, 53 years later, Israel still refuses to do so. The UN and the international community have always recognized Jerusalem as a separate territory, or corpus separatum. This is specifically outlined in UN Security Council Resolution 181, which was adopted in 1947. A further resolution, 252, which was passed in 1968, urges Israel to refrain from unifying Jerusalem, which is essentially akin to annexation. In July of 1980, Israel violated these resolutions and passed a so-called Basic Law, or Jerusalem Law, through which it illegally annexed East Jerusalem and declared the Holy City its capital. The UN Security Council passed a further 2 resolutions in 1980, Resolutions 476 and 478, calling on Israel to desist from altering the character and the status of the Holy City through legislative and administrative measures and censoring Israel's Jerusalem Law. A year later, in December 1981, Israel proceeded to illegally annex the occupied Syrian Golan Heights in violation of Resolution 242 yet again. Israel has categorically refused to abide by any of these UN Security Council resolutions. At this point, it's perhaps easier to count the number of resolutions that Israel has abided by than the ones that it hasn't. At this point, especially after the defeats of 48, 67, and 73, Arab nationalism and support for the Palestinian cause had significantly declined, and Israel now had received not just the full political backing of the West, but also its military backing through NATO, along with various forms of aid and military assistance from the United States and its allies. Throughout the years, one need only look at the map to see how much land Palestinians have lost through one form or another to Israel. And the more land the Palestinians lose, the more they are forgotten by the world and their supposed Arab brothers. Through colonization, war, and annexation, Israel has taken more and more Palestinian land, and even just last year, in the run-up to July of 2020, threatened to annex more of it, up to another 30% of the West Bank, in an annexation plan put forward by Netanyahu. This ultimately did not take place, but the Israelis definitely gained something else instead. The majority of Arab countries do not recognize Israel as a state. However, Israel has succeeded in turning some of them to its side through various measures. Egypt and Jordan were ultimately drawn into making peace and establishing ties with Israel through help, or some might say coercion, by the United States. Recently, even more Arab nations proceeded to recognize Israel and establish ties with the Zionist regime, after then U.S. President Donald Trump pushed through the Abraham Accords in 2020. With the Abraham Accords, through this agreement, Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates opened embassies and economic relations with the Israelis. It had been already known for a few years that some of these Arab kingdoms had ties with the Israelis, but now this was finally out in the open and their cards on the table. There are still other Arab countries who are suspected of engaging with the Israelis, such as Saudi Arabia and Qatar, although they have yet to openly normalize relations with the Zionist regime, but it's rumored they will in the near future. Since Israel is a settler colonialist project, it deeply wants to be recognized as a real country. This is something that the Israelis crave very much. Perhaps one of the only valuable cards that Arab countries still hold is their refusal to recognize Israel. This is the only political leverage that they have, since virtually none exists militarily or economically. More importantly, perhaps, it is a moral imperative not to do this. How can these Arab countries recognize an Israeli state on Palestinian land when the Palestinians do not even have a state on Palestinian land? This is not only leverage, this is not only about leverage, but about common sense and solidarity. And nevertheless, when Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Sudan recognized Israel, they threw away that leverage. When Iran had its Islamic Revolution in 1979, this was not just a rejection of imperialism, beginning with the ouster of the Shah, a puppet installed by Britain and the United States for access to Iran's oil, but also the beginning of a new source of support for the Palestinian resistance. Where the Arabs had failed, perhaps Iran had stepped in. One of the core pillars of Iran's Islamic revolution has been the liberation of Palestine. Under the Shah, Iran had established ties with the Zionist occupation because the Shah was doing the bidding of the West. However, in 1979, Iran severed ties with the Israelis and handed over Israel's embassy in Tehran to the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO. Every year since, Iran celebrates Qudus Day or Jerusalem Day as a show of solidarity with Palestinians and for the liberation of the holy city of Jerusalem. This is not just celebrated in Iran, but also internationally with various marches of solidarity in other countries and cities across the world. Israel has, of course, dubbed the celebration anti-Semitic, which is what it says about any criticism of Israel, and now the holiday has actually even been banned in Germany. We'll be right back after this short break. Joining me is Dr. Daniel Yegic, writer and researcher based in Lebanon. Thank you for taking the time, Daniel. It is great to have you on the program.
Thank you.
So, Daniel, I want to go back a bit in time, in terms of Arab support for the Palestinian cause. We started in 1948 with Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Jordan, Egypt. They all marched to war in the name of Palestine. But, ever since, among each one of them, their support varies and changes over the years. And I was wondering if you could maybe break down why this happened and why you had a kind of split in factions and in terms of, support from the Arab countries towards the Palestinian cause.
It's a very important question. As we can see today, if we start looking at the situation from today's perspective, several Arab countries have officially announced a normalization with the Zionist regime. And of course, this is a result of decades of an increased cooperation between several Arab regimes and the Zionist entity. And of course, it has to do with Israel throughout the last 23 years, becoming quite a strong player in this region, obviously through it being supported by the United States and most Western countries to an extent that allows Israel to expand its expansionist and settler colonialist hegemony that it has in the region. And of course, numerous Arab countries, particularly those that have quite recently announced their normalization with Israel, are as well regimes that are not necessarily democratic countries, but unelected dictatorships that work in accordance with the United States and its allies, which makes them natural allies of the Zionist entity as well. And at the same time, of course, within the so-called Arab world, several countries have never had any conflict with Israel, whereas others, such as beyond Palestine, of course, Lebanon and Syria, are until this day affected by, to some extent, daily invasions by Israel. You can look at the situation in Lebanon, where Israel is invading the Lebanese, at least the Lebanese airspace, several times a day. So there have been different experiences and different orientations towards the Zionist regime that range from opposition to complete acceptance of the Zionist settler colonial project.
Was there a split in terms of support in regard to strategy? Because some countries, perhaps Egypt, didn't want to get drawn into a war with Israel again, and so they hindered the Palestinian resistance. Is that an accurate assessment?
Yeah, definitely. Countries have been under pressure. If you look at Egypt or Jordan, who have officially signed peace treaties, all of this was also based to some extent to keep themselves safe and secure within their own borders. And then to that extent, Palestinians have oftentimes been an obstacle for these regimes in order to enforce their own political, economic goals. And of course, I guess the United States plays a very particular role there as well, which also exerts pressure on its allies to move towards closer ties with the Zionist regime.
I recall a famous speech from the Syrian defense minister, Mustafa Tlass, where he's angry at Arafat for going to the White House, for engaging with the Israelis. And it's actually interesting because in that speech, he actually doesn't mention the occupied Syrian Golan Heights. He speaks specifically about Jerusalem as the capital of Palestine. Why is that? Why does Jerusalem, Al-Quds, hold so much importance? I mean, obviously it's a holy city, but to all the parties who support the Palestinian resistance.
Yeah, it's quite interesting because Jerusalem, I think, is at least symbolically representative of the sole settler colonial inscription and indigenous erasure. This week there have been several new incidents of violence, of settler violence, of Israelis trying to expel Palestinians from their homes. So there's a constant recreation of violence on a territory that is officially occupied under international law. And then, of course, it has a historic significance, being the declared capital of Palestine and plays a particular role in numerous religions, which is why I think it has symbolically as well as politically quite a strong importance, but it's also a declared goal. It has always been the goal of the Zionist settler movement to get to Jerusalem and to convert it into their city, or what they call as unification of Jerusalem. So that's why it is also central in ideas of decolonization and liberation of Palestine.
Yeah, you mentioned the recent violence that's taking place there in Jerusalem, these pogroms, these angry mobs chanting death to Arabs, and the Israeli border police, they're essentially just letting them do it. I mean, what is the current state of Palestinian support from their neighbors and the international community? Because as far as I can see, it's non-existent, right? And this is just happening in broad daylight and no one says anything.
Absolutely. And we're living in times of social media where, I guess, on a daily basis, there are new videos and audio, visual evidence of Israel's crimes, of Palestinians being killed live on camera, evicted from their homes. And the international community has remained either silent to some extent, but at the same time has also, throughout the last decades, reframed the Palestinian cause from a struggle, a colonized people's struggle for liberation, into a sort of diplomatic conflict between two equal sides. This is something, I guess, that we also see in the media coverage also of the latest events in Jerusalem, where oftentimes the situation is presented as an alleged fight between Jews and Arabs, between Palestinians and Israelis, and so on, whereas effectively it is, of course, a very genocidal settler colonial movement, and language plays a very particular role in that. And we see that even, as you mentioned, the Arab regimes that have normalized their ties with Israel as well aren't paying as much attention to that as they might have done decades ago, but the violence has become quite normalized. And even though there are numerous new eruptions of violence, as they have been referred to in the media recently, they are part and parcel of a structure, because Zionism as a settler colonial movement is genocidal in its structure and continues to kill Palestinians and to destroy Palestine. Whereas, again, the international community isn't really intervening, but rather choosing euphemisms and synonyms for ways in which they can maybe reduce, at least linguistically, these genocidal dimensions of Israel's violence.
I want to talk a little bit about Quds Day, or Jerusalem Day. You know, this is something that has been celebrated by Iran to show solidarity with Palestine since their Islamic Revolution. And I wanted to ask if you could maybe expand on that, and also how Iran, being the only non-Arab country in the region, how it's still been a huge support of Palestine in general from 1979 all the way until now.
Yeah, Iran has shown, continues to show strong support for the Palestinian resistance, both, of course, through solidarity, ideology, as well as, I guess, economically and financially. And it is Iran's support for the Palestinian cause has also been an issue for several Arab regimes that have maybe gained more of a distance towards the Palestinian cause as such, but is also used by the Zionist regime in their propaganda, pretty much as in, there's this continuous repetition of Orientalist tropes that the Zionist regime has employed, and whereas it was previously the PLO in particular, or Hamas, it is today oftentimes Iran that is a direct target of the Zionist regime, being accused of anything that has to do with Palestinian resistance efforts. So to that extent, Iran, of course, as a non-Arab country, plays a major role in the continuity of Palestinian resistance efforts and efforts of liberation against the Zionist regime.
Would you say this support that comes from Iran, Syria, Lebanon, the support they give to Palestine, that it's actually one of the main reasons the West targets them for regime change?
Yeah, so of course there is solidarity among the population in these countries, but also beyond in the broader region with Palestine. At the same time, of course, Lebanon and Syria and Iran themselves are targeted by the Zionist regime because Israel's violence has never been restricted to historical Palestine. I think this plays a major role and makes a difference between these countries and other countries in the region that may have more of a normalized or stance towards Israel or not a conflict at all. And of course, at the same time, they are, as you mentioned, victims of sanctions or warfare or both by the United States. It also puts them in a role of a struggle that again connects them to the Palestinian struggle, I guess.
So just to wrap up, I don't know if you heard about this, but just as Iran has its Quds Day, the Israelis have something with a similar name. They celebrate Jerusalem Day, and I don't know if you've heard of that, but the Israelis, they call the Iranian Quds Day celebration anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic. Well, they equate the two. And the Israelis, they celebrate Jerusalem Day. They are celebrating the capture of Jerusalem in 1967, which, in of itself is an act of war. It's a violation of international law. It's ethnic cleansing. Did you know about that? Do you have any thoughts on that?
It makes perfect sense because this whole Zionist narrative is really just based on myths and ways to construct the history and the connection to the land that was not there before the settler colonial movement. And as far as I know, the Quds Day has been celebrations of that day have been banned in some parts of Europe because they're deemed, at least in Germany, I think, those are deemed anti-Semitic and so on, in line, of course, with this very Zionist and actually anti-Semitic narrative that equates Israel with Judaism. But I'm not surprised to hear that the Zionist regime is having their own day because it's also a way for them to inscribe themselves into Palestine and to construct the connection to the land that wasn't there before.
More than 70 years of occupation, war, bulldozing of homes, ethnic cleansing. Israel can only be built at the expense of Palestinians, and always has been. Don't take my word for it. Take the Israelis.
We take house after house. All this area will be a Jewish neighborhood. We are not finished the job. We are going to the next neighborhood, and after that we will go more. Our dream that all East Jerusalem will be like West Jerusalem, Jewish capital of Israel. אני רואה בזה המשך של המפעל היהודי-ציוני, המשך שיבת ציון, זה הכל. זה בא על חשבון הערבים? כן, גם בג"ץ והכנסת בנויים על חשבון ערבים, וגם המדינה כאן הוקמה, כן, על חשבון חלק מהתושבים הערבים שגרו פה. וזהו.
The Palestinian issue is really not a complex issue. It's very simple. All these educational videos, reports, documentaries, and people who rewrite and whitewash history, they want to frame it as a war. It's not a war. It's an occupation. It is a settler colonialist project born out of the ashes of the British Empire. The only difference between the right-wing Israelis and regular Israelis is their methodology, but the result is still the same.
שישרף לכם הכפר, מוות לערבים, זה מייצג אותו?
אולי לא בדרך ובצורה הזאת, אבל אני...
באיזה דרך אז?
אני מדברת יפה. אני לא אומרת שישרף לכם הכפר, אני אומרת שאתם תעזבו את הכפר ואז נגורו בו. זה בדיוק מה שאנחנו עושים בעיר העתיקה, אגב.
Ethnic cleansing is a crime against humanity, and in order to justify its occupation, Israel seeks to criminalize any criticism of Israel. By shutting down even the mildest criticism, the Zionist occupation defines the boundaries within which any speech about it is permissible. Israel uses its lobbying power in the United States and Europe to ensure that politically and culturally, people are not allowed to criticize it. Although the majority of Arab people support the Palestinian cause, unfortunately, it seems there are not many governments left who do. Who, besides perhaps Syria, Iran, Lebanon, Iraq, and Algeria? It seems that some Arab governments have forgotten their brothers in Palestine and the holy city of Jerusalem, which is at least what they signal when they accept this occupation and establish ties with it. Nevertheless, despite the varying degrees of support from Arab countries throughout the years and the international community's inability or unwillingness to hold Israel accountable, this doesn't change what Zionism fundamentally is. It is a racist, settler, colonialist ideology that treats Palestinians as third-rate citizens and uproots them from their homes. It is incumbent upon every human being with a conscience to oppose Zionism on moral and ethical grounds and to see the situation for what it is. It's an occupation. The Palestinian struggle is a struggle for human rights. It is a struggle against imperialism, against colonialism, and against oppression. Everyone, all across the world, should support the Palestinian cause and the Palestinian people. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Richard Medhurst, and this is The Communiqué.